The Puppeteer in the Swirling Prismatic Void, a DMT, LSD and Cannabis trip report by Flaminio, posted to earwid.org August 19th, 2010. Note: for about a month before this experience, I was taking 200 milligrams of sertraline, Zoloft, once daily. I discontinued use 36 hours before the experience. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we were sitting around a friend's living room with a respectable quantity of DMT and LSD. It was my first experiment with DMT, though I'd been on high doses of LSD, salvia, and mushrooms before. The first hit of the DMT that I did made me feel cold and weird, and gave me tunnel vision. I did a second hit, and held it in for some time. I felt myself melting into the couch and my head lolled to the side. The room around me was fracturing into twisting pinwheels of rainbow-coloured light before my eyelids dropped shut. I panicked a bit at first, because the stuff was so strong that I couldn't control my body, but soon my ego completely flatlined, taking my worries with it. In that moment, I didn't know or care who or where I was. Before me was a huge carousel of somberly shaded purple, grey and blue lights. I seemed to hover nearer and further away from it. When I began coming back, the room was swirling in a twisting vortex of multicoloured light. Spiritual sensations and ideation were completely absent from the trip, but these would come soon enough though. For some minutes afterwards, I felt a euphoric lift. It was now about 6 in the evening, and with both of my best friends and myself having smoked a dose of DMT each, we decided to drop the first hit of acid. We each dropped a second hit about 15 minutes after the fact. By 8 o'clock, the acid began to peak. My trip centred around patterns in perceptual streams, much like the last time I did acid, and I meditated about layers of depersonalised intentions behind perceptions for hours, often losing entire grasp of who I was as the room began to twist around me, shivering and swelling into patches of rainbows. I began to feel that the LSD had initiated some sort of auto-deconstructive process in the stream of perceptions constituting my identity. This was somewhat frightening, but also exhilarating, as I began to realise what it meant for our whole universe to be reflected in electrochemical interactions between cells, which could then be reconfigured in a way that temporarily altered the fabric of the universe itself. Pretty standard stuff for LSD use. My trip felt very material, except at times when I would feel strange, creeping flows of spiritual energy slither through the room. I managed to write the following at 10:19 that night, while the peak was still going strong and my ego was totally gone. To chronicle the cognitive distortions during an LSD peak requires the utmost concentration and focus, because the acid smattering, weirdo collision universe is out there, and my thoughts don't know where I am when I'm thinking them. The body is strangely alienated from me, as well as my cognitive processes, some of which twist into crystal fractal dimensions very far away from where they started. That's the beauty of LSD, the surprises. I reach out from behind the corner and frighten myself, or catch myself catching myself. The sensorium is obviously broken or dislocated somehow, disarticulated, but it's the resulting logical fragments that are truly terrifying. The most bizarre and interesting aspect of being on acid is that the sensorium has been totally disarticulated and reconfigured. I don't know where sights, sounds, feelings, etc. begin or not, and I begin or end in these data flows, losing myself in tides of beautiful colours and profoundly, sadly incommunicable emotions. Some of the phenomena of my consciousness seem stereotypical and weirdly trite. It allows me to see the tides of media corruption, cartoony weirdness creeping as a constant undercurrent in my thinking. It's that multicoloured stew, underlying all perceptions, making them swirl together. When the flows of sensation become interrupted, patterns emerge in them that reveal intentions that are not my own. That's the origin of empathy. The problem of empathy is really what I'm after, isn't it? The problem of empathy with things that aren't me. The whole wide, material universe isn't me. That's the central thing that most people can't grasp. The absolute horrifying, endlessly multivarious and splentrificalifying multi-wordoverse. The profound sadness of realising there's nothing there to realise. That's why I do hallucinogens. A perverse sort of jadedness with all sensory and emotional input. Because in striving for an absolutely different sensation, I lose track of what I am. In trying to realise there's nothing to realise, something interferes between the realiser and the abstract, the happening of evento weirdliness. There's a process trying to deconstruct itself, a pattern that emerges in the conscious flow of perception, and then catches itself, trying to realise what it is, but in viewing itself, it unwinds again into strangeliness. It takes LSD to realise the true nightmare horror strangeliness of perceptions piecing and stitching themselves into the pattern of a person, which is always endlessly re-echoed in electrochemical reactions that splinter apart and break up and reconfigure the thing that thought it was thinking about them. There are levels of impersonality and automatism. Personality isn't simply an on-off switch. When I turn off the light of the ego identity, the perceptions can take on their own logic and re-echo endlessly. It takes LSD to realise the profound sadness of our whole universe being merely electrochemical states that are disrupted. But of course, the simple mechanism there is inadequate. For LSD, it also reveals that there is something pulling the strings. That's what I try not to remember that the acid is telling me. That something is pulling the strings of my perceptions that isn't me. There are multiple not me's in fact, an endlessly re-echoing not me. That's all the material universe really is, a place where I am not. I can grasp that the really startlingly simple correspondences that German idealism is trying to grapple with. The perceptions auto-deconstruct themselves in an endlessly, Byzantinally complex fashion when they begin trying to realise what they are, and they initiate a series of logical states that take over the show and the syntax of the sentence, obviously. That's probably another problem with LSD. The linguistic faculties are all messed up too, and they're trying to reveal these endlessly complex perceptual processes with nothing really behind them. One thing that's interesting about the LSD is that it makes certain reaches of thought, certain images, certain lines of self that aren't normally privileged, come alive. The self begins to figure out that all consciousness is a matter of puppetry. Layers upon layers of perceptions and automatism coordinating the perceptions with nothing at the core. There's a fundamental mismatch at the core, and then the glitch just plays itself out with a tragically necessary logic. That's what a human personality is. Culture pulling the strings, and making the perceptions dance in a way that convinces most people there's a semblance of a person there. But really, there's nothing. And one begins to figure out the cavernous emptiness of the universe when it becomes unclear whether it's contained inside the skull or not. Perhaps it could never be contained in a human skull. These things were never meant for these poor, blind, ugly, organic beings on this rock in the middle of so much unending, nothingificating unconsciousness. The oddity of the oddverse that isn't so much me anymore. Revealing that so much of human personality is just this tragically simple game of, here's the thing, now take it away. Once I begin to realise how frightening it is that the endless, multivarious complexity of the material universe could be echoed in anything. When I begin to think that what is reflecting the endless complexity of the material universe isn't a mirror or an unbroken surface of water, but this blind labyrinth of cells, firing action potentials in the darkness of something's skull on a rock that no one can even see except for the seers of the rock. The rest of the universe is a blind, staring, undark light. No wonder these patterns of consciousness can never pull themselves together. That is what styles do. They string perceptions together into a self. But normally, the unconscious is there. It's a tape of weird, unprocessable thoughts, sense data, etc. All that sense data my brain is excluding. Those populations of neurons are making decisions about what to show me and what not to show me that are separate from the phenomena of volition. But the LSD reveals how frightening it is to have such a muddy medium to be reflecting the mirror for such a complex darkness. When the acid had lost just enough intensity for us to realise where we were and what we were doing, we decided to smoke the rest of the DMT. We loaded another dose into one of the pipes we'd been smoking out of before and began to inhale. It didn't take me long to blast off. The first few times we hit the pipe were almost too bewildering to recall, but afterward, I began to see huge grids of rainbow light twisting and warping like a film of oil on the surface of a puddle of water. This began to subside, and then one of my friends informed us that he could scrape together a bowl of pot resin. We placed this in a bowl of a bong we'd been smoking DMT out of earlier and inhaled it. The pot resin mixed with the DMT and began to get us incredibly high. We couldn't even feel the THC at first, as we were sucking in so much DMT. However, I feel that the THC complemented the LSD and the DMT, making the perceptual phenomena generated by both chemicals gel somehow. The first time to smoke the DMT on the acid, the chemicals seemed to clash, with the DMT overtaking the LSD. It took the pot to bind the hallucinogenic sensorium together into a coherent world of sorts. After lazing around on couches, smoking DMT and pot for about an hour, my eyes drifted shut, and I began to see incredibly complex, prismatic entities. Mayan gods, shaped like stonefish with mouths opening and spewing out clouds of single-cell organisms. Lizards, comets, clouds, multitudes of anteaters drooping down the sides of a cliff. The canopy of a rainforest at night was seen from below, as if I were lying on the ground, splitting into kaleidoscopic reflections of itself in drops of water which wriggled into the shapes of frogs. My whole body would fragment, shattering into furry mammals and snakes which would scamper and slither into the undergrowth. At other times, my arms and legs twisted into vines, tree limbs, and roots. Most of the imagery I saw was incredibly complex, constantly shifting and interlacing like gothic foliation, but made up of tropical vines, galaxies, and molecules. Sometimes, this imagery would turn into patterns like those in Aztec or Mayan architecture. I began to feel my soul being flooded with spiritual energy. My mind blossomed into a huge ornate temple, and images of various unrecognizable gods danced through it. I placed my hands together and held them over my head to direct a blasting column of light straight into my skull. There was other times where everything around me swirled into rainbow storms of birds and insects that looked like a cross between moths and the leaves and tendrils of exotic plants. Often, I'd see myself floating above clouds, as well as mountain tops alongside bizarrely animalistic spiritual beings. Sometimes, the DMT would take memories of experiences I'd had and twist them into its landscapes or populate them with animals and gods. I couldn't open my eyes and kept repeating to my friends that I'd entered a visionary state. It was by this point that more people arrived at the house, and I escaped to my friend's bedroom in order to commune with the DMT in solitude. I turned off the lights, lay down on the bed, put on some headphones, and listened to Coils, and the ambulance died in his arms. For a while, I merely lay there wondering at the incredible beauty of the closed-eye visuals. Suddenly, without noticing the transition, I found myself in the midst of a spiritual breakthrough. Here's an account I wrote immediately after the experience, at 2:33 in the morning, while the euphoria and perceptual distortions were still going strong. At a certain point in the trip, I realised that I wasn't an individual anymore. There was something else that told me that it was all things, all peoples, all identities. It told me that it could wear our perceptions like masks. It asked me, how could I ever think of myself as being separate from all that manifold complexity? I saw huge, spiralling, churning rows of heads, human, animal, stone, and the thing was chasing itself through all of them, churning them up, stirring up perceptions into people. This thing made me feel that my whole identity was nothing more than an empty mask to it, unless it chose to inhabit that mask with beautiful complexity. It then made me feel that inside my mind itself was so much of this complexity, that the complexity of those perceptions mirrored, made room for, etched in, limned and sanctified all the animal heads, the dancing whirling world, the prismatic voids, threatening to shatter human minds to show them what they're worth, that their most intimate contents are nothing more than playthings to something much vaster. It then left me churning into other waves of images and patterns that the DMT had left me with. "What are you?" I kept asking, but it did not answer. It seemed as if it almost laughed at the impudence of the question. It was later on in the night that I also felt that inside my head was an infinite number of beings as well, that the complexity of my perceptions and the colonial nature of my own consciousness united me with other beings, as well as separating me from them. It was always a mistake to view that complexity as a barrier, rather than a bridge. Also, this thing was asking me why I denied the spiritual structure of material reality. It then went on to show me an extra dimension of reality, which was made of interlacing patterns uniting all things, beings. This spiritual reality was supported by pillars of light, complex patterns of stone and animal heads, and the entity pressed my head into one of these pillars, asking me why I didn't believe, and my mind was flooded with interlacing imagery. I understood then, in that moment, that I was united with all things. These patterns, these interlacing patterns, the ones generated by the DMT, they froth up the boundaries between entities and tangle them together. The heads were all stretched out in a row which curved as if it were the crest of a wave or the slope of a hill. They seemed almost like graves or monuments. The entity that I encountered wasn't itself visible. I could only glimpse it in the ripples it left as it moved through twisting, churning webs of light. I understood that the complexity of the perceptions in me was what united me with all things. I was merely one stream in an endlessly intertwining river of perceptual streams. I kept repeating to myself, "I am many things, I am many things, I am many things," knowing that even in myself the perceptions of a multitude of different entities were churning together in a little whirlpool of a human mind seemed to unite me with the endless complexity of the universe. The spiritual reality I witnessed was made of fractal patterns of animals and plants that twisted together and interlaced between all objects, both organic and inorganic. It was a huge, warping, prismatic fabric that wove the universe together. Certain parts of this fabric thickened into towering pillars, shooting through intensely glowing bluish light. It was one of these pillars that the entity had held my head against, and the zigzagging animal patterns that danced across it tangled together and crept into my thoughts, destroying the boundaries between my own identity and the rest of the universe. So, after this point in the trip, I felt more spiritually energized than ever before in my life. It was only later in the morning that I began to worry I'd seen things that no human being had seen before, and I'd finally broken my head for good, which I guess is always a sign of a great trip. I decided to see if I could sleep it off, and surprisingly had very little trouble getting to bed. When I woke up 7 hours later, I was a little foggy and disoriented, and I had a bit of a headache, but otherwise I was fine. Within 24 hours of this experience, I no longer noticed any after effects. And you know what? All in all, this was certainly the most intense experience of my life, and perhaps the most beautiful as well.